Hello out there and welcome. My name is Laolu Akode and you are on to Inside Sources. My take for the week is about the fact that some senators from a section of the country have expressed their worry over a few things earlier this week. In their statement, they are worried about what they described as the lopsidedness in the distribution and allocation of resources in the 2024 budget and the relocation of some federal agencies from Abuja to Lagos. Specifically, they are worried about the relocation of some CBN departments, including banking supervision, to Lagos from Abuja. They are also worried about the relocation of the Federal Airways Authority of Nigeria from Abuja to Lagos. Without prejudice to the merits or the demerits of these relocations, I think there are bigger issues for which the senators need to be raising the L together with other of their colleagues in the Senate. These are more important issues to the nation. These include, number one, the continuous slide of the Naira that is now exchanging in the parallel market for over 1,300 Naira to the dollar. With the real fears that this thing can get really, really worse. Solutions such as the Afrexim NNPC 3 billion loan deal, which is meant to be a drastic measure to ameliorate the foreign exchange liquidity, is not yielding results fast. This is because 1 billion was announced to have come in and the balance, we assume, is on its way. But it may be insufficient because the central bank has a backlog of over $6 billion in remittances alone. So $3 billion ain't gonna cut it. The senators have said nothing about this. They've been entirely silent about this deal. What about the rising inflation, especially of food prices in the country? In fact, experts say the exchange rate, which we just talked about, has an effect on domestic prices. The Naira fell by over 38% in 2023, according to Bloomberg. It is now the third worst performing currency in the world. So that also affects the prices. Inflation, which is already at an all-high of over 28% as at last month, is projected to continue to rise further. And month-on-month inflation is expected to get to as much as 2% higher this month. The senators have not raised L about this. Number three, they are not talking about multidimensional poverty or the serious challenges of insecurity in the country or the problems of unemployment. The senators are not raising L about this. These are some of the issues we expect the senators to please raise L about and pile pressure on the executive rather than raising issues about relocation that does not change the price of anything in the market. How does the issue of relocation of CBN departments and FAN affect the bigger issues? Dear honorable distinguished senators, the appeal therefore today to our distinguished senators is to press hard on the issues that concern the ordinary man. That is where we need their voices to be raised the loudest. They should worry less about all of these sectional permutations that does absolutely nothing to the mass majority of our people. And that is my take for the week. Inside Sources will be back with our guest for the day. Welcome back to Inside Sources. And today we have yet another formidable, impressive, and eminent Nigerian as our guest on the show. He was, I think he's still a professor of political science, president of the ASU, and a former chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission. I'm privileged to welcome Professor Atairu Jega to Inside Sources.
Thank you so very much for inviting me and welcoming me to this program. A very commendable program, I must say.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Prof. You know, I recall your days as the president of HASU, you know, and those were my own earlier days as a reporter, you know, and you did some excellent job in HASU. But we're going to get to HASU later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. So I normally start the conversation by asking, do you think that the current trajectory of our country, you know, in a broad sense, do you think the current trajectory is such that can take us to that desired greater Nigeria that all of us dream about?
Thank you very much. I can say that, as I quite often say, that I'm an incurable optimist about the future of our country. But I wish that the way we are going, it's better, because what we see leaves much to be desired. So we have to keep on working very hard in order to get it right. I must say that whether you look at the way in which the challenges which bedevil our country as a nation in terms of politics and socio-economic challenges are being addressed, we could do better. And I get worried that one can say, regrettably, that people come into positions of governance and with all the good intentions, either they get overwhelmed by the routine work of governance in such a large country like Nigeria, or they came in with inadequate preparation because they were too focused in winning elections and getting into power rather than preparing adequately for what to do when they get into power.
Wow.
And this has been a tendency that has prevailed for quite a long time under this democratic dispensation. So to be honest, while I remain an optimist about the future of our country, from what I see, I think we need to do more in order to be on the right trajectory to address those fundamental challenges which bedevil our country. So you asked broadly, so I've given you a broad response.
Exactly, yeah. And it's just a good way to take off. So, so now let's look at the between 1999 and now. We've had President Obasanjo, President Yaradua, President Jonathan, President Buhari, and now President Tinubu. Now, how much of the responsibility of the situation we are in now, how much of the responsibility should go to those presidents, in your view?
Well, I think they all share responsibility. I will give little to late President Yaradua because he started and got consumed by clearly what was known before he even became the president in terms of his ill health, and therefore wasn't able to do much. But the little that he did, for example, the way in which he addressed the issue of militancy in the Niger Delta, I think everybody has commended it. You know, but all of them have shared some responsibility. Again, Yaradua was able to create the framework for electoral reforms because he was courageous enough to admit right from day one that the election that brought him into power was faulty and that he was going to create a committee to review the electoral process and make recommendations. And that was how the Justice Muhammad Lawal Uwais Committee was established, which I was privileged to be a member and made far-ranging recommendations. You know, so but obviously, as he became ill, the governance process was seized or hijacked by some people and were too busy, I believe, to satisfy their own selfish interests than to focus on what required to be done in terms of governance and getting Nigeria out of the quagmire that we got into, both economically and politically. So all of them share responsibility, but I think what is important, which we must bear in mind, is the fact that we commenced this journey in 1999 after a very long period of military rule, almost 30 years of almost a generation of military rule, with its culture, with its mindsets, and the legacies of military rule were so deeply embedded, and that some of those who became presidents were also former generals who clearly in their mindsets and in their orientations have those deep-seated cultures and attitudes prevalent in the military. You know, so regrettably, I must say that the issue of authoritarian disposition, the issue of undemocratic disposition of our leaders, the issue of lack of inclusiveness, and the issue of a hierarchy of authority that seems to even have distorted our federal arrangement, all these are legacies of military rule. You know, so the hope, and in fact that's one of the hopes that people seem to have, that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has been somebody who has struggled, who has no military background, and who people expect and had high hopes that he might be able to contribute to addressing some of these challenges. We truly hope that he becomes outstanding in terms of addressing those challenges. But regrettably, what we see so far, maybe it's unfair because he's been there just for a few months, but what we see does not give much confidence that the challenges would be remarkably addressed. Right.
Yeah. So what specifically, just to get on that point, what are the specific things that you think, right now don't show, is not as encouraging as expected? Maybe one or two examples.
One key example from what we hear is the prevailing corruption in the sphere of governance. And many of it is already coming out, but there is a lot being said that is not yet out in the public domain. I can tell you, for example, now, the TET Fund had just announced, with the approval of the president, funds to go into the tertiary education sector. And if you hear what is happening, some people already positioning themselves and trying to twist the vice chancellors. It's terrible, So that mindset, of using power and positions to access public resources for personal selfish ends, rather than using the opportunity of public service to contribute to adding value to institutional development and growth, and in particular to ensuring revitalization of institutions such as educational institutions that have really been bastardized in our country. You still see it, and you have even seen worse things, So that's one example. The other example, of course, relates to, in general, the patronage system, which pervades governance and which undermines the integrity of governance. And we see examples of it. Not much seems to have changed. And even where things are done with the best of intentions, the communication is such that, actually miscommunication, if I can put it that way, create fears and suspicions and feeds into mutual distrusts and the confidence, So all these issues, frankly, are worrisome, and the hope is that with little time, we will move on into a situation in which we will have a more focused trajectory of addressing some of these challenges. For example, issues of the cost of governance, issues of the distorted structure of our federal system, and the issue of equality of opportunity.
Yeah, we're going to come to
for all citizens.
We're going to come to that because I actually have your convocation lecture, I think, in Bauchi, where you detail some of these things. But I wanted to dig further, in trying to examine, the leadership, the quality of leadership from 1999 up to date. And you did make a very important point about the military context, that had existed before 1999. So do you see any significant difference in the way Obasanjo conducted his succession program from that of Buhari?
They are different individuals, so therefore they are bound to have different ways in which they handle issues. I think clearly, I stand to be corrected. Obasanjo tried to be a bit more inclusive, maybe in a cunning manner, but certainly more broadly based and nationalistic in his approach. And I think it had to do with his own orientation. While people knew for a long time that even from his days as a military head of state, that Buhari was rather reserved, a bit more introspective, and therefore in governance as president, it became very, very clear that his governance style was not as broadly inclusive and accommodative. It was a bit more reserved if you were to compare it with, say, Obasanjo. So these are differences, but the key issue is how have they contributed to deepening democracy in our country? And what is clear is that the more we go further from 1999 to date, the more it appears that we are entrenching those issues that make it even more difficult to nurture and develop a democratic political culture amongst the citizenry and among the elite. And we are increasingly having serious challenges in building institutions that can help deepen our democracy.
So how do we break free from that?
The only way to break free, to my mind, maybe not the only way, but the best way to my mind, is we have to begin a process of developing what I call elite consensus on certain key national issues, in which once we have consensus on those issues, we will begin to get out of this tendency, whoever comes will do his own thing. But that we have to keep on building and adding value on those issues on which we already have a consensus on. For example, there is no doubt anybody who knows, who understands the history of this country and who has studied it, knows that the structure of the federation leaves much to be desired, and it needs to be improved upon. And if you compare Nigeria as a federation with all the other federations in the world, you can see remarkable differences which, if they are not addressed, will continue to push us in the direction of identity politics of the negative type, and into increased mutual suspicions and fears amongst the constituent elements of the country, and which will also undermine the extent to which governance, not just at the federal, but also at the state and local level, will address the fundamental needs and aspirations of citizens. So also, we will need a consensus with regards to how to address the economic issues in this country. whether it is the issue of addressing poverty or the issue of increasing economic growth, and what will be the parameters and the variables to focus upon. Regrettably, for a long time, maybe in fact since 1999, we seem to lack the requisite independence in terms of developing economic policies that can help economic growth targeted at the home market, not just at export, and through the guidance of the IMF and the World Bank. We have been consistent on that. And unless our leaders begin to chart out independent courses, you can listen to IMF, you can listen to World Bank, but at the end of it all, it must be what you believe is right for your country, rather than just yielding to the pressures and the arm twisting and all the things that the IMF and the World Bank are known to do. So that has to be addressed, and it is not being addressed. We need a consensus, for example, in terms of how to improve manufacturing, which is key in terms of economic growth, how to ensure production for the home market, while you still think of what are the comparative advantages which relate to export and the foreign exchange generation, and in particular, by developing manufacturing for the home market, how to also ensure employment opportunities and employment generation, particularly amongst our youth, and how to address this challenge of tackling the negative aspects of the youth bulge and turning it into an opportunity for economic growth is also something that needs to be addressed. So long as we continue to listen to IMF and World Bank, we will not be in a position to independently address these challenges. Because what they are telling us to do are things they have told other countries to do, and we've seen the negative consequences of those.
So how do you now enforce, how do you enshrine, or do you need to enshrine the consensus? How do you turn the consensus into a compelling agenda that everybody's, succumbs to? How do you, what's the mechanics of the elite consensus, if I may say?
Well, consensus normally is arrived through discussions, consultations, dialogue, and normally consensus is not unanimity, but it's a general agreement that, look, since the majority have agreed to do this, and we all now agree that that is something we can live with, then we do it. So that process of consensus and the engagement, broad-based, has to be catalyzed one way or the other. And the best way to do it, obviously, is to begin to find people who share the same ideas, who can sit and begin to identify the issues over which there should be consensus, and then continue to expand that by bringing all segments of the elite. So the challenge, as you rightly pointed out, is to move from the romanticization of the idea and what we normally do, where we just sit and express things and move, to begin to get people who can devote time and energy to ensure that this process is driven. And we can get institutions also that can actually go behind it and be supportive in that regard. And it's very, very important. It's an idea, once the seed is sown, that can grow very well. But the elite have to recognize, because the problem of the Nigerian elite, particularly those in the maybe 10 percentage point at the top, is that everybody, most of them have, in fact, virtually all of them have what do you call it? They don't, and pardon me, I don't mean to be, but they lack an enlightened self-interest. Everybody is looking for here and now. What do I get now? And in the process, they are bound to kill the goose with the golden egg. Because in their struggle to just take the golden egg, they can kill the goose, and then everybody loses. And that's what is happening, because people are already talking about Nigeria has failed or is failing and unless we really begin to chart out a clear trajectory with a consensus in terms of where we are going, then obviously what we fear may happen, and God forbid.
Very, 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 very important point about enlightening self-interest, because of course, being a political scientist, we know this was even the trajectory of even some of the Western countries when they got to the point of enlightening self-interest, that it is in their own interest, as a matter of fact, to, for instance, ensure that there is rule of law and democratic norms. Now, so that takes us to the issues of our political parties, and I wanted to ask you. So we have two dominant parties now, say three, but especially the two that have a bit of history behind them. PDP, the ruling party from 1999 to 2015, and APC that has been ruling from 2015 to now. Have you seen any significant differences in the ideology, in the posture, in the practices of both parties?
Not much. The clearest evidence of why there doesn't seem to be much difference is even the ease with which people shift from one party to the other. People who may have contested as presidents under one party, next cycle of elections, you see them contesting as presidents under another party. So clearly, I think that is a major problem. And as far as I'm concerned, we need to work very hard to strengthen political parties as institutions in our democratic development. Right now, political parties can be said to be one of the weakest links in the chain of democratic development. Very, very sad, because they are the platform for leadership recruitment, for identifying those who can be presented to the public to choose amongst those that are presented by different political parties. But when the process in the parties themselves is captured by a few people, either because they have money or because they have power, because it used to be money bags. Now it is governors who have also become money bags, or people in elective positions at the federal level, like the presidency and others. So they tend to determine even those who are elected as delegates to a conference, and therefore they tend to have a grip hold in terms of who emerges within party conventions and party primaries. So that capture really needs to be addressed, and the best way is, scholars have long said that you can't build democracy with undemocratic mindsets, and it appears that the most deeply seated mindset within Nigerian political parties are those with undemocratic mindsets. And it's a very, very serious challenge. So we have to find a way, of changing these mindsets. And of course, it is not enough for citizens, again, to disengage from the process, to say that this process has been captured. So people have to really struggle. It's a product of struggle, whether to create new parties or to enter into existing parties, because the more good people go in there, the more the chances of widening the space and improving upon it. But the tendency we see in Nigeria is good people say, in court, good people will say, look, the terrain is so murky and dirty that we don't want to soil our feet. And so you sit on the fence and you allow the bad people to continue to have a field day. Although, and obviously change doesn't occur like that.
Although, of course, we've had a few people also get in and get properly messed up,
No, that is
but I agree entirely with you that it's a struggle, But you make a point, about the governors. Do you think, that there has been so much focus of our politics and governance on the center in such a way that has enabled governors to become some form of monarchs, and at times get away with blue murder. Do you share that view?
No, I do. I certainly do. I believe very strongly that we've concentrated so much power and the resources at the national level that many people, even segments of the elite at the state level, are more focused in terms of what they get at the center, and rather than really struggling to ensure that the process of governance at the state and local levels are broadly inclusive and participatory, such that there can be good governance at that level. Because if you have good governance at the level of the state and the local levels, then obviously the ordinary people will benefit more. But what we have is a situation in which all attention is focused at the national level, and resources and the power is concentrated there. And then the governors, by virtue of their access at the federal level, also become demigods and do whatever they like. It's a very, very serious problem. That is one of the reasons why I advocate deconcentration of power and the resources from the center to the other tiers of governance. It may sound contradictory because many people are saying that the governors who are demigods now, if you give them more resources and power, but my argument is that the more resources and power at the local level, the more people will now focus attention in terms of what happens there of governance at that level. You can no longer blame Abuja for everything. If it is resources, they are there. If the governors are, then people will struggle to make it better. And there is no other way. Frankly, if you look at the experiences of other federal systems from doing that, yeah.
It's interesting. So since we are on that, so what do you think about state police at this point of our evolution?
I've always supported the idea of state police. I think what has happened is that immediately after colonial rule, because many of the, at those times, regional and local policies under the native authority system were creations of colonial masters. And when they left, particularly in the period of the First Republic, politicians abused them. So our mindset when we remember those abuses is to not want to have anything to do with state police, because those were the reasons and justifications that the military used in order to centralize policing in a federal system, which is a misnomer.
It is.
Because in every federal system that exists today, policing is local. You can have some level of federal police, maybe to do with investigations and cross-border crimes, or to address inter-state issues. But in terms of providing law and security at the level of state or local government, you need policing at those levels. A situation where, for example, and this is well known for a very, very long time, where a governor is said to be the chief security officer and there is a commissioner of police who takes directives from the inspector general of police. We have seen the conflicts and the contradictions which further create insecurity rather than security in those contexts. In fact, increasingly, the governors provide all the resources for policing, most of the resources for policing at the local level, but then they don't have a say. We need state and local police, but there has to be a constitutional basis for that. And I think right now what has been happening is that even without the necessary legal constitutional framework, the necessity of criminality and insecurity at the local levels is making people to act, in my view, even extra constitutionally to address these challenges. And many of these things you've mentioned are emerging basically like vigilante groups, not necessarily very formalized state institutions and structures. for addressing insecurity and ensuring law and order and so on. So we need to address this issue within a constitutional framework rather than the ad hoc nature in which we see it. Because this ad hoc nature also begins to convey the impression that these things are also becoming ethnically based.
Right.
You know, whereas if you have a state police, it doesn't mean it's only people in your ethnic, and you can recruit the best people to head the institutions of law and order, not necessarily people who are your tribesmen or religious groups and so on.
In any case, it should reflect the composition of the state.
Absolutely, and it is very, very important. I mean, if you look at other experiences, when they advertise to select who can be the chief of police in a state, say California or Chicago or somewhere. They can take people from anywhere.
People from Washington, D.C.
Yes, because they are just looking for competence and capacity and the ability to address the challenges. And then, of course, they are given implementable goals on the basis of which they are assessed. You know, otherwise they can be removed and other people brought in. You know, but the way things are going, it has become like, look, our region, our people are suffering, you know, and we create our own ethnically based policing system, and in the long run it's going to be even more negatively consequential. So the earlier we address the constitutional issue, provide the framework, you know, so that people can address this as a constitutional matter, as a governance issue, rather than as a sub-regional interest matter.
Interesting point. So before we get to, because I also want us to get to electoral issues, you know, I mean, so that we can take from your experience as INEC chairman. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you about, so we talked a lot, you know, here and there about ethnicity and religion. Now, how can we turn ethnicity and religion into a positive force in our politics?
Ordinarily, diversity should be a positive force. But in our own country, beginning from colonial rule, diversity has been used to create mutual suspicions and fears in order to perpetuate colonial dominance. And unfortunately, we have not been able to free ourselves of this. And we should have done that when we became independent. The easiest way to do it, to my mind, well, in terms of creating the institutions and the processes, you know, but it will take time before the attitudes change. So the easiest way in that context for me is to give greater attention to citizenship rights. And unfortunately, in Nigeria, even though our constitution is very, very clear about the rights and the obligations of a citizen, in practice, you find that this issue of indigenship seems to take precedence over citizenship rights. And so long a country continues to pay attention to primordial definitions of rights rather than recognition of the right of a citizen wherever he or she will be in the context of the country, problems will continue. So to my mind, these issues, and people tend to look at them in terms of North-South or Muslim-Christian. It has gone beyond that. Every opportunity I have, I kept mentioning, you know, how mostly people talk about Northerners in Calabar or in Enugu or in or Yorubas in Kano or Sokoto, but it has gone beyond that. If you look at Sokoto people living in Kano, same religion, same broad ethnic background, is the same thing. You are seen as a foreigner, you are not from here, you are not an indigene, and therefore you are denied most of the fundamental rights that you ought to have as a citizen, whether it is access to education or health facilities or even political access in terms of participation. If you are a citizen under normal circumstances where citizenship is given right, if you stay in a place for a particular period, you have the right to not only vote but be voted for.
Yes.
In Nigeria, it's very, very difficult, even though historically we have antecedents of people being mayors in Enugu who are from the north and so on and so forth. Now it's increasingly very, very difficult.
Although we have Senator Ireti Kingibe now.
Yes, in Abuja, but Abuja, you know, you can't compare it with a state in the normal sense in terms of composition.
Yes.
In that context, you know, so the challenges are still there and they are deep-rooted. So to my mind, we have to begin to address this issue of citizenship. If you are a citizen of Nigeria, and citizenship is defined in the Constitution very, very clearly, either by birth or by parentage, you know. So those strict definitions, you must have
keep to them.
The rights and the obligations of a citizen wherever you are. You know, and it's only a matter of actual implementation. You know, but what we have now, many governors, if not all the governors, they tend to give preference to indigenship rather than citizenship rights. And frankly, this is the major obstacle, because then it gives prominence to whether it's ethnicity or religion or even some concocted historical origins, which are not necessarily correct, but just to justify excluding others, you know, and promoting we rather than them. You know, so to my mind, frankly, we need to address our attention to that. And then the second thing we need to do, by virtue of the recognition of these citizenship rights, is the equality of opportunity. Everybody must be given equal access to state institutions, state resources, whether it's in terms of employment or services, you know, and this should be justiciable. If you are denied those rights, you can go to court and enforce your rights, you know, and unless we begin to do that, frankly, religion and ethnicity will continue to become major factors and will continue to hold us down, rather than helping us in terms of getting the most benefits from our diversity.
Interesting. You know, before our time is fast spent, I want to come to electoral issues. First, to ask you, in your own view, how do you assess INEC in these 2023 elections? INEC made a big deal of the IReV portal, how it's going to be real-time, and that didn't quite happen, especially with the presidential election. And in my view, you know, it has really affected the reputation of INEC. But what's your assessment?
Well, broadly, my assessment is that in 2023, INEC did its best under very, very difficult circumstances. And a lot of these difficult circumstances, I regret to say, were caused by the mindset of our reckless politicians who want to win either by hook or by crook. INEC over time has introduced technology in order to make elections and the processing of election results very transparent, you know, with integrity. But from my own experience, when I was in INEC from 2011 to 2015, and I suspect that a lot of that has continued to be so up to 23. Our reckless politicians try to stay ahead of INEC, at least a step ahead of INEC. If you introduce something today and you try it, they try to find a way to be ahead of you
and beat it
by the next election. And of course, they can also use ways and means to not only truncate, but to also to bypass something that has actually been put legitimately in order to add to the integrity of the process. If you ask my opinion, I feel very, very strongly that INEC needs to tell us more about what happened with the IReV. In fact, at one point, I was even calling for a thorough public inquiry into what actually happened with regards to IReV. You know, so I feel that something has happened, which, in spite of the confidence and the very articulate manner in which the chairman of INEC had presented the IReV, it then failed.
Yeah, he did a good job of making the point, but then it was like over-promised and under-delivered.
Yes, so over-promised and under-delivered, but was it his fault? So that's a big question that, of course, INEC really needs to come forward. I can understand that maybe they have not been saying much about it, largely because of the cases in court. But as these cases are resolved and addressed, we need to go back and get to the bottom of what happened with regards to IReV. I believe, I must say it, I believe that some of our reckless politicians may have infiltrated it and truncated it. You know, unfortunately, INEC would have to take blame for that.
Very, very, very important, Brian. I like your view that it's important for INEC at the right time to tell us exactly what happened, and we'll be looking forward to that. But let me ask you, you know, something interesting for which, you know, the whole nation witnessed. So when you were announcing the 2015 election, we remember the drama of Orubebe, you know, right there at the center, at the venue of the announcement. And then eventually, you know, President Jonathan, even before you formally announced the result, called then General Buhari to say that they had considered the election. Was that did that, you know, action of President Jonathan, did it bring you a relief, you know, compared to what you had to deal with an Orubebe right there at the venue?
Well, frankly, everybody has commended that action in a country where we didn't have a history of losers calling winners and commending them. But in terms of the way in which we managed the elections, frankly, we were just focused on having done an election that we felt confident was a good election, just trying to finish it. And we were not willing to allow anybody to distract us from concluding what we had prepared very well to do. And that was, to a large extent, what guided my own attitude to the rantings of Mr. Orubebe at that time, you know, because it was evident that all the points he was making were mistaken. I wouldn't say false, but mistaken.
Right.
And I was worried that if it ended abruptly and we didn't have the opportunity to give our own side of the story, many Nigerians will go away with the impression that what he was saying was right. Actually right.
You know, like I said at the beginning, you know, you and I actually got to know each other, you know, when you were president of ASU, and I was a correspondent. I was covering ASU headquarters at the University of Ibadan, you know. And I remember the 1992 strike, which you led. In between, there was a proscription, the name of ASU was changed and everything. And eventually, there was a solid agreement, you know, between ASU and the then General Ibrahim Babangida's administration. You know, so maximum eight weeks, the strike was over. These days, we have strikes going on for months. What do you think has changed between now and then?
Well, a few things regrettably have remained the same, you know, but I believe in 1992, what was prior, remember, we'd been on that struggle since 1988.
Yes, true.
But in 1992, I think the country was lucky to have a professor, a very distinguished, forthright professor with integrity, Babs Pafunwa of blessed
as the
memory.
Minister of Education.
Yes, as Minister of Education. And even though ASU was proscribed, they had found ways of reaching out to ASU and understanding the issues very well. And I believe that because the tendency in government, and regrettably it has continued up to now, is to perceive a trade union as irresistible, as a troublemaker, and looking at the messenger rather than looking at the message, you know. And because of that, it's in the larger interest of the country and that needs to be addressed is quite often ignored because of that perception that these are people who are trying to cause trouble for us. They are not our supporters, government, and all they want is to do strike. And so nobody looks carefully at the demands that are on the table. Right. And in 1992, Babs Pafumwa was able to understand what the issues were, and was also, I believe, able to convince President Babangida at that time, you know, to recognize that there are truly issues that needed to be addressed. And they constituted a committee, even though ASU at that time was under proscription. They constituted a negotiating committee. And of course we participated in that discussion, and in the end it became very, very clear that something needed to be done to rescue the university system, and that many of the demands that ASU was making were legitimate and were in the larger long-term interest of our country. So that was how that issue was resolved. Regrettably, again, even though we're in a democratic dispensation now, we had ministers who had this mindset that we talked about earlier on, that continue to perceive unions as troublemakers rather than looking at the issues under discussion. And I regret to say Ngige was one of those ministers, and that was why all those issues have dragged. And up to now, it's only now that there is an absolute need for this government to look at these issues to see how they can be addressed. Because a lot of those issues were also issues that have gone back to 1992 or 1996, where government had made undertakings and has not been able to address them, and is refusing to actually sit on the table to address them. You know, so obviously times have changed, and as times change, new people come in with different attitude and mindsets and dispositions, you know, but I believe that a lot of the issues that ASU has been raising with regards to the Nigerian tertiary education system in general, and the universities in particular, are really issues that government needs to pay attention to. If we truly want to have good universities that can be competitive as they were before globally, and that can add tremendous value to our progress and development as a country. With this new phenomenon in which universities cannot recruit, you know, universities cannot even retain some of their best products, where people who are passionate about the country, in spite of offers abroad when they graduated, have returned back home, but they have no facilities to do research or to teach research knowledge. Because there is a difference between just routine teaching and teaching researched knowledge. Many of our universities have under capacity in terms of teaching research knowledge, and many people are so frustrated that they are just looking the slightest opportunity to leave. So it's very, very important that government pays attention, you know, but dialogue gives opportunity for peaceful resolution of disputes, and it is about give and take. And academics can make very forceful arguments, you know, using evidence-based research. You have to be able to counter that. So developing the capacity to counter that is very, very important. But you can't wish away problems, you know, because you just don't want to agree that there are problems. So I think if you're talking about the difference between 1992 and what has been happening subsequently, to a large extent, that is it. And you know, and I agree with you to a large extent. But you know, strides going on for several months, you know, completely jubatizing a whole session, impact on the students. You know, don't you think that's a stretch? No, it's a terrible stretch. We should hope that we see the end of that. You know, no serious university professor would want to be idle. And in fact, many of them, if they can't teach, will try to do research. Those who are able to do it outside of the context of a laboratory and other things. So frankly, the mindset of a serious academic is not focused on being away from his or her job, you know. But sometimes people are pushed to the wall.
Right.
And it is the nature of trade unions that once they are pushed to the wall, then they have no other way but to respond with a strike, which is the last weapon of resort. So frankly, it's regrettable. I wish that government will engage the unions in the tertiary education sector to have a substantive agreement that can really take us away from this perpetual cycle of one strike to another.
Thank you so much, Professor Tairu Jega, for such an exciting conversation. You know, our time is fast spent. You know, I wish that we can continue, and I'm sure that our viewers too have engaged, have enjoyed this engagement. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, viewers. That is another edition of Inside Sources. And Inside Sources will return next week. My name is Laolu Akonde. Have a nice one.